They rang the bells for him. All across London, from St. Paul's to the slums of Southwark, they rang a deafening, jubilant symphony of iron and hope. October air cracked with sound. Bonfires lit the dusk like beacons. Bread was thrown to the hungry. Wine ran through gutters like rivers of red salvation. A son had been born, a boy, a Tudor boy. Inside the red-bricked walls of Hampton Court Palace, Henry VIII, old, wide, blood-eyed from years of war and wives, stood before a cradle gilded like a reliquary. His fingers, still stained with ink from the proclamation of birth, trembled as he reached out to the squalling infant wrapped in cloth of gold. "God has answered me," he whispered, and perhaps, for a fleeting moment, it felt true. 20 years of miscarriages, dead infants, broken queens. He had torn England in two for this. Torn churches from Rome, torn women from thrones, torn his own daughters from legitimacy. And now, here he stood, king, father, redeemer of his own bloody saga. The child wailed, fists clenched, as if he already sensed the weight that had been placed upon his chest. He was named Edward, after the Saint King who had once ruled in peace. But peace would not touch this boy, not truly, not ever. From his first breath, Edward was England's property. The nursery became a sanctum of superstition, filtered air, sterilized milk, fires that never died. His cradle a throne before he had teeth. His blankets inspected hourly. His nurses watched for omens in the shape of his coughs, his sleep, the twitch of his mouth in dreams. Outside, the people cheered. Inside, the court whispered, "He's small, too quiet. Is it enough?" But none dared say it aloud. Not to the king who had sacrificed so much to bring forth a son, not to the monarch who saw a frail infant and chose to see a conqueror. Plans bloomed faster than the child. Tournaments were commissioned for his 5th birthday. Tutors appointed before he could walk. A sword was being forged for the hand still clutching milk. Edward Tudor was England's future, and from the first beat of his heart, that future was already cracking beneath the gilded surface. The court would spend the next years dressing up that crack. In silk, in ceremony, in the colors of power and providence. The people would see only the boy's smile from balconies, the gloss of his portraits, the words written for him. But the truth, the hideous, rotting, gasping truth, would grow like mold in the velvet shadows of the palace. This is not the story of a prince who lived. This is the story of a prince who decayed, piece by piece, breath by breath. And when the bells tolled again, years later, slow and mournful, London wept for a lie. Because Edward VI, Golden Boy of England, was never truly alive. He was embalmed from the beginning, wrapped in prophecy, drenched in expectation, and laid, still breathing, in a coffin made of dreams. Part 1. The Cradle of Control. He did not cry the way healthy babies cry. Not at first. Edward's first wail was thin and too quick, like a torn ribbon of sound, sharp and short, vanishing into the stale air of the royal chamber before the midwives could exchange glances. One of them, older than the others, muttered something about omens and was swiftly dismissed. But it was too late. The silence had already begun to root. The palace moved quickly to erase doubt. Proclamations were shouted from the gates. The king's guards delivered barrels of ale to the townsfolk. Priests offered masses of thanksgiving. It was all written. The birth, the strength, the glory. But inside the nursery, truth crawled along the floorboards like frost. He was small, painfully small. His limbs were no thicker than a goose quill. His skin so pale it verged on translucent. When he sucked on his nurse's finger, there was no strength in it, no urgency. Just the slow, weak rhythm of a child who didn't yet know how to want. The court called it a delicate constitution, a phrase that clung to Edward like a second baptism. Whispers curled beneath the silk tapestries. Was this the son England had waited for? Had God answered or mocked? But Henry VIII refused to see frailty. All babes are fragile at first, he thundered, waving off concerns with a jeweled hand. He will grow strong. He must. The king's visits to the nursery were brief and uneasy. He loomed like a storm cloud over the cradle, his armor creaking as he leaned in, searching the baby's face for signs of himself. But what he found was a stillness he did not understand. So he left, and the boy was left to the women, and the physicians, and the rituals. The nursery became a machine of vigilance. No draft was permitted to enter. Every corner was lined with velvet to stifle sound. Cloth soaked in rosewater was hung over the windows, over the fireplace, over the door, filtering the world into a soft, sanitized version of itself. The midwives scrubbed their hands raw in vinegar and rosemary. The nurses whispered psalms between feedings. His milk was tasted before each feeding, his lips dabbed with silk. His swaddling changed hourly, lest dampness infect his lungs. If a fire smoked too heavily, servants were dismissed on the spot. If the prince coughed even once, the entire staff held their breath. The child did not smile. He rarely cried. He simply watched. Big blue eyes that did not blink often enough. A stillness too complete for an infant. His spirit is quiet, Lady Bryan said, the head nurse. But her voice lacked conviction. They dressed him in cloth of gold. They laced his cradle with pearls. They played him lullabies on lutes carved from ivory, but he would not laugh, not even once. Outside the nursery, the kingdom rejoiced. Bonfires still smoldered in village squares. Merchants in Canterbury and York painted Tudor roses on their storefronts. Prayers of thanksgiving echoed in cathedrals from Cornwall to the Scottish border. They did not know what the nurses knew. They did not hear the thinness of his breath at midnight. They did not see the blue veins that pulsed beneath his skin like river maps drawn too close to the surface. To the world, Edward was a miracle. To the court, he was a talisman. To the women who held him as he wheezed through sleep, he was a sacrifice in progress. One night, Lady Bryan watched him twitch in his cradle, his tiny fists curling at nothing, his lips working as if he were trying to form a word before he even knew what words were. She whispered to the dark, "They want you to save a kingdom, but you cannot even save your own breath." She touched his forehead. Burning. Already, the fever had come. Already, the long unraveling had begun. Part 2. The Scholar and the Shadow. By the age of 6, Edward Tudor had learned to bleed in silence. Not from swords, not yet, but from remedies disguised as healing. The cuts of physicians were sharper than blades, their cures more punishing than plagues. And each day the ritual began anew. He woke before dawn, roused not by warmth or affection, but by duty. The fire had already been stoked to royal specifications, his doublet starched, stiff, heavy with embroidery, weighted like armor. His hair was combed to perfection, though his scalp flinched beneath the touch. His body, small and too often fevered, was molded into the shape of a monarch. By 7, he was seated before a table far too large, face to face with Dr. Richard Cox, a man whose beard twitched with impatience at every pause. "Again, Your Highness," he barked. "A prince's Latin must be as sharp as his blade." "Amo, amas, amat," Edward whispered, tracing the ink-stained parchment with a shaking finger. "Louder," Cox snapped. "A king must command not only armies, but attention." The boy tried again. His voice cracked, his chest ached. The words were blurred by heat. And then came the cough. Always the cough. It tore from him like a secret clawing its way out, wet, rattling, unrepentant. His hand flew to his mouth. When he pulled it away, there was pink on his fingers. The room went still. There was no mention of illness, only intervention. Physic was summoned. A goblet of wine thick with pearl dust and powdered antler. It slid down his throat like syrup and sat in his stomach like molten lead. "You are England's mind," Dr. Cox said, "not its muscle. Remember that." But Edward remembered everything. Every spasm, every suppressed gasp, every night the fire burned too low and his bones screamed with cold. He remembered the day his cousin was caught peeking through the nursery door and whispering, "He looks like he'll blow away in the wind." He remembered his father once clapping him on the back before a foreign envoy, whispering, "Stand straight, smile, make them believe." He remembered Mary, his half-sister, slipping into the room with contraband Catholic beads, laying a cool hand on his brow and murmuring, "You're burning." "All children run warm," the nurse had lied. But Edward knew. He had always known. Outside the walls of his schooling, the world called him brilliant. He mastered theology with ease, quoted Erasmus before breakfast, memorized battle formations from Roman histories while other boys played with wooden swords. But inside his body, a quiet war raged. His lungs already failing, his limbs already fading, his blood already poisoned by the very medicine meant to save him. He was England's scholar, but scholars were not meant to bleed into silk pillows or tremble when the wind howled through the halls. At night, when the tutors had gone, when the physicians stepped out to sharpen their knives or debate the planets, Edward was left alone with his quills and his coughing. He sketched maps, not of kingdoms, but of fantasy victories, places where he was strong, where his arms held weight, where his enemies fell and his breath was sure. Sometimes, when the pain was less than unbearable, he hummed an old lullaby his mother once sang, a tune half forgotten, half imagined. It was the only thing that felt like his. One evening, the Archbishop Cranmer visited. Edward had just translated a passage from the Greek Testament with such clarity that the old man beamed. "You are not merely a prince," Cranmer said. "You are a blessing." Edward smiled faintly, but his eyes strayed to the window, to the courtyard, where stable boys shouted and chased each other through mud and sunlight. He watched them with a longing that did not belong to kings. That night, as his nurse wrapped him in 4 layers of linens and tucked rosemary sprigs beside the hearth, Edward whispered, "Do they know?" "Who, my prince?" she asked. "The world, the people. Do they know I'm not enough?" Lady Bryan paused, hand hovering over the final blanket. "They don't need to know, Your Grace. They only need to believe." Edward turned his face to the wall. His chest rattled, his hands shook, and in that moment, a terrible truth rooted itself in his heart. If he could not live like a king, he would learn to die like one, quiet, dutiful, obedient, not because it was noble, but because he had no other choice. Part 3. A body built from blood. He began to smell like sickness. It clung to him, faint at first, masked by lavender and musk, the kinds of things royal children were bathed in. But beneath it, something rank crept through. Sour sweat, the iron tang of blood, the slow putrefaction of a body being whittled from the inside out. No one spoke of it, but everyone noticed. The leeches were now daily. Their tiny mouths left ring-shaped bruises across his ribs and arms, black-purple halos on translucent skin. They swelled fat on his blood, then were peeled away, tossed aside, and replaced. "See how he bleeds," one physician said with a smile. "His humors are active. A good sign." Edward said nothing. He was 11, or perhaps 12. Time had blurred. He kept track by the number of scars on his arms and the number of times he had heard someone murmur, like his Uncle Arthur. Prince Arthur, Henry's elder brother, had died at 15, coughing, drenched in fever. Edward knew the story. He knew its ending. He just wasn't allowed to say it aloud. The physicians swirled around him in perpetual motion, capes brushing the floor, hands full of drafts and tinctures, faces pinched in scholarly worry. Mercury, crushed emeralds, boiled gold, antlers, rhubarb. No concoction was too expensive, no theory too wild. "He is the future of the crown," they reminded each other. "If he dies, we all fall." So they fed him poisons in silver goblets and called it salvation. They watched his fingernails flake like ash and called it purging. They held him down as he vomited bile into silk sheets and whispered, "Balance restored." When he was lucid, Edward wrote in a small journal. One entry read, "They say my lungs are too warm, that the stars are aligned against me, that bile rises in my throat because Mars burns above the Thames. Perhaps, or perhaps I am simply dying, and no one has the courage to name it." Lady Bryan saw it. She had nursed many Tudor children. She knew the difference between weakness and wasting. She saw how he no longer flinched when the lancet bit, how he no longer tasted the food, only swallowed because he must. At night, she would wipe his forehead with cloth soaked in rose water. Once she whispered, "They are killing you." He blinked at her through fever-glazed eyes. No anger, no fear, just understanding. Still, the illusion had to be maintained. He was dressed for public viewings. Thick padding beneath velvet doublets, berry paste smeared across pallid cheeks, a powdered wig placed carefully over thinning hair. Ambassadors would bow and call him England's golden boy. He would nod, smile, recite lines given to him, then retreat behind the curtains, vomit into a basin, and lie on the floor until the tremors passed. Henry still visited, rarely. He clapped his son's shoulder, pride swell in his chest as he boomed declarations of vigor and promise. A true Tudor! But he never stayed long. He never stayed long enough to see the sweat that soaked Edward's collar or the way his lips turned blue in cold rooms. And Edward, ever the prince, never begged him to stay. He had learned by then, a king does not beg. By the end of his 13th year, the physicians began to whisper of rot. The ulcers will not close, they murmured. The lungs wheeze like bellows. His blood is thick with phlegm. The stars are unkind. They burned more herbs. They drew more blood. They called for more mercury. Edward stopped writing in his journal. One night, he asked his nurse, "If I die, will they still call me brave?" She choked on the answer. He didn't wait for it. He simply turned his face to the pillow and whispered, "Then I will make them believe it." And as another fever took him, clawed down his spine and filled his mouth with copper, the boy who had once been England's miracle surrendered a little more of himself to the sickness, and no one dared stop it. Part 4. The Masquerade of Majesty. The day they painted his lips, Edward said nothing. He sat, slumped in a high-backed chair, as servants dabbed crushed root onto his mouth, rouge onto his cheeks, powder into the hollows beneath his eyes. "To give you color, Your Highness," the maid whispered. He wanted to laugh, but even that cost breath he no longer had. His body had become a theater, and the show must go on. The coughing had worsened, no longer dry and fleeting, but deep, rattling. Pulled from a place behind the ribs where light did not reach, he bled nightly, in his sleep, on his pillows, in his hand when no one was looking. The physicians bled him more to stop the bleeding. They called it logic. Edward called it madness. He stood now only when commanded, only with help. The walk from his chambers to the throne room was rehearsed like a war campaign. Pillows were placed along the hall in case he collapsed. Pages stood ready behind curtains to catch him if he stumbled. "Steady, Your Highness," one whispered, gripping his elbow. They must not see, because seeing was knowing, and knowing could unravel it all. Inside the hall, Henry waited, clad in cloth of gold, crown heavy on his thinning hair, his pride still wrapped around Edward like iron chains. "Straighten up," he muttered as Edward approached. "The French must see England's strength today." Edward nodded. His lungs burned, his knees wobbled, but he nodded. The great doors opened, trumpets screamed, and the boy king, 13 years old and dying, stepped into the firelight. For one moment, the illusion held. The padded doublet made him look broad. The rouge made him look alive. The jewels at his throat glittered like hope. Then the cough came. At first he tried to suppress it, to swallow it back into his chest like a secret, but it tore free, loud, wet, viscous. The hall fell silent. He pressed his hand to his mouth. When he pulled it away, blood glistened in his palm, bright, damning, undeniable. A whisper slid like a blade through the chamber. "He's dying." The French ambassador recoiled. A goblet fell. Somewhere a lady gasped. Henry moved fast, too fast for a man his size. He threw his arm around Edward, shielding him from view. "My son," he boomed, voice dripping with performance, "is overcome with joy at your presence. Tudors are passionate." The court clapped, too late, too loud, too afraid, but their eyes betrayed them. Darting to the boy's shaking legs, the blood on his sleeve, the way he seemed to fold beneath his father's grip like parchment in the rain. That night, Edward did not speak. He lay beneath 4 blankets, shaking from fever and shame. He had failed. He had let them see. The illusion, his final armor, was cracked. Outside, London celebrated still. Bells rang. Toasts were made. Inside, the boy who bore a crown in name only watched shadows crawl across the walls and whispered to the ceiling. I am not their prince, I am their puppet, and my strings are soaked in blood. Part 5. The Collapse. It came with no ceremony, no royal announcement, no falling star, just the sharp crack of knees against cobblestone as Edward collapsed in the palace courtyard, mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-breath. His attendant screamed. The world tipped sideways. Boots scraped. Hands clawed at velvet to catch him. The boy who had once been England's hope now lay sprawled like a discarded doll, his limbs bent wrong, blood at the corner of his lips. Call the king. Fetch the physicians. God save the prince, but God had not answered in years. He awoke hours later beneath heavy sheets, in a room that smelled of vinegar and beeswax and rot. The curtains had been drawn tight. No light was allowed in, as if truth might slip through with the sun. He opened his mouth. Water, he croaked. But the cup they brought him tasted bitter, metallic. Another potion, another lie. He drank it anyway. The physicians whispered by the hearth, their faces pale and slick with sweat. The ulcers have spread. The lungs are almost gone. It is irreversible. They said the word only once and never again. Consumption. The same word they'd whispered for his Uncle Arthur. The same death, the same silence. Henry was summoned. He entered like thunder, eyes bloodshot, cape dragging. He looked at the boy in the bed, the bones beneath the skin, the weeping sores, the stink of decay, and for a moment he faltered. But the mask came quickly. "This is no fit state for a prince," he roared. "Why have you let him become this?" No one answered. What could they say? You demanded illusion. You forbade truth. You turned medicine into torture and a boy into a vessel for your legacy. The remedies grew crueler. They bled him not in droplets now, but in rivers. The lancet carved deep, and the bowls filled too fast. They strapped blisters to his chest, rubbed sulfur and egg white into his wounds, fed him mercury till his teeth came loose. He stopped screaming, stopped speaking. His body twitched, flinched, convulsed, but his lips stayed shut. A king does not cry, even when his skin peels, even when his stomach rejects food and blood comes instead. In the palace halls, they whispered, "He will not last the summer." The king denied it. He doubled the prayers, tripled the incense, ordered the linens changed thrice daily. "No one must know," he growled, but everyone already did. One morning, the archbishop arrived with holy oil. "It's precaution," Henry said, voice cracking. "Just tradition." But the room stank of death. The boy could not sit up, could barely lift his hand. Lady Bryan knelt beside him, weeping into her apron. She had raised 3 tutors. This would be her last. Edward looked at her. His lips moved. One word: free. No one was sure if it was a wish, a prayer, or a farewell. That night, the convulsions began. He thrashed, arched off the bed, his spine bowed like a drawn bow. Foam, flecked with blood, bubbled at his mouth. The leeches, full and sluggish, detached and fell to the floor like rotten fruit. The room erupted into chaos. Prayers shouted over sobs, syringes prepared, poppies boiled, but it was too late. The disease had won. At the final chime of the palace bell, 2 hours past midnight, Edward stopped breathing. His mouth hung open, his hands unfurled, the linens beneath him soaked in a soup of blood, pus, and crushed petals that no longer masked the truth. And in the thick silence that followed, history shifted. The Golden Prince of England had died, not with dignity, not with grace, but in agony, consumed by the very hopes he was born to carry. Part 6. The Aftermath. They worked fast. Before the body had fully cooled, the servants stripped the bed, burned the linens, washed the floors with lye and rosewater. The curtains were drawn open, incense burned in every corner, and the room was repainted in illusion. The prince passed peacefully, said the official report. A sudden illness, a holy death. Called too soon to God's embrace. No mention of the ulcers, no word of the rot, no trace of the screams. The court mourned on command. Black cloth draped the windows. Nobles wore sables and teardrop pins. Priests delivered sermons about Edward's piety, his intellect, his divine promise. Painters rushed to finish portraits showing a healthy boy, smiling, eyes clear. But beneath the sorrow, a different scent began to rise. Relief. Edward had been a question mark, a frail, dying riddle at the heart of power. Now, finally, there was space to move. The throne sat empty, but only for a moment. Mary moved first. Eldest daughter, Catholic, hardened by exile and humiliation. By blood and law, the crown is mine, she said. Northumberland countered. Sharp-eyed, cold-hearted, his fingers wrapped around another name. Jane Grey, Protestant, pliable, royal, by a thread. The court split. Whispers turned to shouts. Power turned to a blade. Jane was crowned for 9 days. Then Mary came with banners, with fire, with the voice of the people. Jane went to the Tower. Mary took the throne. The boy they had all bled dry was already being forgotten, but not by everyone. Lady Brian kept his final handkerchief, stiff with dried blood, in a cedar chest. Elizabeth wrote nothing, said less. She watched, she listened, she endured. Mary wept once, alone in her chapel. Then she ordered the first heretic burned, as England reeled, first from war, then from faith, then from fear. Edward's memory was twisted into legend. A scholar king, a gentle prince, a symbol of lost promise. But the truth slipped through. Smuggled letters, doctors' ledgers hidden in cellars, one laundress who disappeared after selling the prince's blood-stained sheets to a Spanish agent. Years later, a historian would write, they embalmed his image before they buried his body, but the rot beneath could not be silenced forever. In time, Elizabeth would wear the crown, the court would cheer, the kingdom would rise again, burnished and proud. But every fire cast a shadow, and in that shadow was a boy who coughed blood into silk, smiled on command, and died unseen. The Tudor line had not died with Edward, but something more fragile had, the illusion of control, the fantasy of invincibility, the lie that power can save the sick, or that a crown can shield a child from death.